Wars are fought over oil, land, water, but rarely over history, especially about something that happened nearly 100 years ago. But that's what Turkey and Armenia are still fighting over: what to label the mass deportation and subsequent massacre of more than 1 million Christian Armenians from Ottoman Turkey during the First World War. Armenians, and an overwhelming number of historians, say that Turkey's rulers committed genocide, that its actions were a model for what Hitler did to the Jews. The Turks, meanwhile, say their ancestors never carried out such crimes, and that they, too, were victims in a world war. Ever since, this battle over history has not only ensnared the two nations, but even the White House and Congress, where resolutions officially recognizing the genocide are currently moving through the House and Senate. But our story begins where the lives of so many Armenians ended, far from Istanbul, in the desert. We took a drive into what is now Syria, to the barren wilderness, to what amounts to the largest Armenian cemetery in the world.
As many as 450,000 Armenians died here.
Peter Balakian is an Armenian-American author who's written extensively about what happened in this desolate place.
450,000 Armenians died here in this spot in the desert.
In this region called Deir Zor, yes. It's the greatest graveyard of the Armenian Genocide.
Deir Zor is to Armenians what Auschwitz is to Jews. The most ghoulish thing about the place is that 95 years later, the evidence of the massacres is everywhere. Just a short distance from the banks of the Euphrates, there's a dump. It's also the site of a mass grave. It has never been excavated. All we had to do was scratch the surface of the sand to collect evidence of what had happened here.
It's the hill full of bones, fractures.
Little fragments of bones.
Yes.
Dr. Harut Karvegian, an Armenian dentist, was our guide.
This is the bone of the
wrist?
The wrist. And
Been lying here for 95 years.
Yeah. Here we go, more here.
Look at this one.
My God. Looks like a joint bone.
yes.
Nobody bothered to dig them up until now.
It was extraordinary standing on a mound where perhaps thousands of people lie entombed. There's no record of who they were or where they could have come from.
Look at that. We've got these kids who know this area just picking up bones by the dozen.
Evidence comes in many forms. It comes in photographs, it comes in texts and telegrams, and it also comes in bones.
So just how did all these bones end up here? In 1915, the First World War was raging and the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. The Armenians were a Christian minority who were considered infidels by the ruling Muslims. The fifth column who sided with the enemy in the war. The fact that they were prosperous didn't help, says Balakian, whose great-uncle survived the genocide and wrote about it in the memoir Armenian Golgotha.
Like the Jews of Europe, the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire had a dominant role in commerce and trade. They were highly educated.
And highly resented.
And highly resented.
What happened next?
What happens from the spring of 1915 on through the summer is a well-orchestrated project of government-planned arrests and deportations.
Some were forced to buy round-trip tickets for train journeys from which they never returned. They ended up in boxcars. The rest, mostly women and children, were forced on death marches, hundreds of miles. Many perished from starvation, disease, or brutal killings. The survivors ended up in concentration camps hundreds of miles from Istanbul, out of sight.
At the time of the deportations, American diplomats in the region sent dispatches to Washington detailing what they had seen and heard. Just weeks after the arrest of Armenians had begun, Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. ambassador here, sent off this one. Deportation of and excesses against peaceful Armenians is increasing, and from harrowing reports of eyewitnesses, it appears that a campaign of race extermination is in progress.
To this day, the Turks vigorously deny there was any such campaign. When we spoke to Nabi Sensoy, He was Turkey's ambassador to Washington. We were in Syria, sir, and we scratched the sand and came up with bones. How can you argue with that?
Well, bones you can find anywhere in Turkey, you know. There have been a lot of tragedies that happened in those lands.
Excuse me, sir. We dug up these bones in a place called Der Zor, which Armenians say is their equivalent of Auschwitz.
Well, I don't think there was anything comparable to Auschwitz. This was only deportation, and things happened on the road.
But the deportations ended in massacres, didn't they?
No, it did not.
Weren't there massacres, mass executions, and death marches of the Armenians?
There was no death marches of Armenians. There was deportation, and tragic things happened. Many people perished under the deprivations of the First World War.
But did what happened in 1915 amount to genocide? The UN defines it as the intent to destroy a racial, ethnic, or religious group.
The most important thing is the intent. The killings is something else. It happened on both sides. But whether it constitutes genocide is another matter. It's a legal word, and it should not be lightly used.
But you're saying there was no intention of the Turkish government?
There was no intention of annihilating in whole and part the Armenian population.
Bishop Sarkin Sarkisian is convinced that the massacres were intended and meticulously executed. He showed us one of the caves into which, he said, untold numbers of Armenians, women, and children were thrown.
Looks like you could walk for miles down here.
I think so. I think so.
It was, the Armenians believe, a primitive gas chamber.
They lit fires at the mouth of the cave.
Yeah,
And the people inside couldn't breathe anymore.
exactly. And there is no other way to escape out.
The Ottoman Turks developed a template which, according to genocide scholars, was later to be adopted by the Nazis.
And most dramatically, we have Adolf Hitler saying 8 days before invading Poland in 1939, who today, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. Hitler was inspired by the Armenian extermination. You know, it made him think, well, sure, you know, you can get rid of a hated minority group, and if you're powerful and your side wins, that event will never get recorded.
The Turks dispute the evidence that Hitler ever uttered those words or was inspired by the events of 1915. Nonetheless, when the Ottomans were swept from power and the modern Turkish state was founded, all memory of what happened to the Armenians was erased. Records were destroyed, a new alphabet was adopted, and ever since, the massacres have not been taught in schools. The use of the word genocide is regarded as an insult to the Turkish nation. It is a jailable offense. Hrant Dink, who edited an Armenian newspaper in Turkey, was prosecuted 3 times for insulting the Turkish nation. He also received thousands of death threats from extremists, but kept on writing. His daughter Dalal recalls the Turkish authorities telling her father they couldn't protect him.
They were kind of warning my father about what might happen. And the days following that, nationalist groups came in front of Agos.
In front of your father's newspaper?
Yes, in front of the newspaper, shouting that he is their target and he is their enemy. And one day they will come for him.
Days later, as he stepped outside that same office, he was shot at point-blank range. Dink is viewed as a martyr now in Armenia, where he is seen as the latest victim of the genocide. His picture emerges from the Wall of Flowers on a hillside outside the capital, Yerevan, where every April, hundreds of thousands attend a memorial to remind the Turks and the world of what they went through. They pay homage to those who died nearly a century ago. It's as if the entire country turns out for what is emotionally a funeral, a burial the victims never had. And on the same day, in Times Square, thousands of Armenian Americans gather to demand that Congress pass a resolution recognizing the genocide. 2 years ago, when a resolution was to be put to a vote in the House, Turkey recalled Ambassador Sensoy in protest. Its president warned of serious troubles,
And its top general said military ties with the U.S. would never be the same. To limit further damage, the Bush administration and 8 former secretaries of state weighed in to kill the bill. It worked.
8 former secretaries of state rallied behind Turkey to defeat that resolution.
Yes.
Why do you think that was, sir?
Well, I think it's the importance of Turkey for the United States. We have a long list of positive agenda between us.
And the items on that list, Sensoy says, are far more important than the Armenian issue. Turkey is, after all, a regional superpower and an essential broker between the U.S. and the Muslim world. It has the second largest army in NATO, and the U.S. relies on the country's air bases for its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. 70% of American supplies to those wars go through Turkey, which is also a crucial conduit for oil. Which is probably why no U.S. president has uttered the word genocide. During his presidential campaign, candidate Obama promised that if elected, he would use the word. The Armenian Genocide, he said, is a widely documented fact supported by an overwhelming body of historical evidence. But when President Obama made his first overseas trip to Turkey, he never mentioned the word. Late last year, the U.S. brokered an agreement between Turkey and Armenia to establish diplomatic relations with one key condition, that a historical commission be formed to rule on whether a genocide took place. Nearly 6 months later, the deal appears to be unraveling. The battle over the use of the word is far from over.
Last year, when archaeologists detected what they believed to be 200 unmarked graves at an old school in Canada, it brought new attention to one of the most shameful chapters of that nation's history. Starting in the 1880s and for much of the 20th century, more than 150,000 children from hundreds of Indigenous communities across Canada were forcibly taken from their parents by the government and sent to what were called residential schools. Funded by the state and run by churches, they were designed to assimilate and Christianize Indigenous children by ripping them from their parents, their culture, and their community. The children were often referred to as savages and forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. As we first reported earlier this year, many were physically and sexually abused, and thousands of children never made it home. The last of Canada's 139 residential schools for Indigenous children closed in 1998. Most have been torn down, but the Muskowgan Residential School in Saskatchewan still stands. Its windows boarded up, its rooms gutted. A reminder to a nation that would rather forget, a 3-story tombstone for generations of children who died here.
Sometimes I wish it would be gone for all what happened here.
You wish this had been torn down?
Yeah, I could hear everything in here, what was done. It lingers.
Leona Wolf, who comes from the Muskowgan Reserve, was 5 years old when she says she was taken from her home in 1960. School officials and police would often show up unannounced in Indigenous communities and round up children, some as young as 3. Parents could be jailed if they refused to hand their children over. When kids arrived at their schools, their traditional long hair was shaved off. If they tried to speak their language, they were often punished.
They put me in a little dark room like that. And they'd shut the door, and then they'd take off the light. All I had to look through was this much light, like I was in jail.
She says the abuse many kids at Muskowgan suffered from the Catholic priests and nuns wasn't just physical.
Father Joel was fondling the girls here.
A priest, Father Joel, was fondling girls?
Yeah, this used to be sick bay. They used to have a bed here.
And he would take girls into the bed?
Yeah. My cousin.
He took your cousin in here. How old was she?
Yeah. She was only 8. I grew up a very, very mean woman because of all what happened to me.
You learned that here, you think?
Yeah.
She is not the only one. more than 150,000 children were sent to residential schools, which Canada's first Prime Minister supported to, in his words, sever children from the tribe and civilize them. For much of the 20th century, the Canadian government supported that mission. This report aired in 1955.
They learn not only games and traditions, such as the celebration of St. Valentine's Day, but the mastery of words.
The idea for the schools came in part from the United States. In 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School opened in Pennsylvania, where this photo was taken of Native American children when they first arrived. This is them 4 months later. The school's motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Consequently, ours was to kill the Indian in the child.
Kill the Indian in the child.
Mm-hmm.
That was the guiding principle here in Canada.
Yeah.
Chief Wilton Littlechild, whose Cree was 6 years old when he was taken to this residential school in Alberta. Then, he says, he was given a new name.
My name was number 65 for all those years.
Just a number?
Just the number, yeah. 65, pick that up, stupid, or 65, why'd you do that, idiot?
What does that feel like at 6 years old to be called a number?
Well, I think that's where the trauma begins. Not just the physical abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, and worst of all, sexual abuse.
You were sexually abused?
Yes. I think that's where my anger began as a young boy.
Chief Littlechild says he was able to take some of that anger out on the school's hockey rink. He won a scholarship to university and graduated, eventually going on to a distinguished career in law. But his story is the exception.
They didn't kill my spirit, so I'm still Cree. I'm still who I am. I'm not 65. My name is Maikan Motil, so they didn't kill my spirit.
In 2008, after thousands of school survivors filed lawsuits, the Canadian government formally apologized for its policies. It also set up a $1.9 billion compensation fund and established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Chief Littlechild helped lead. For 6 years, the commission heard testimony from survivors across the country.
And she put me underwater, slapping me and hitting me, slapping me and hitting me and punching me and holding me underwater, pulling my hair. And I thought, God, she's going to kill me. I'm going to die. First day of school.
We as little boys and little girls, we lost our innocence.
In 2015, the commission concluded what happened was cultural genocide. It identified more than 3,000 children who died from disease due to overcrowding, malnutrition, and poor sanitation, or died after being abused or trying to run away. A government study in 1909 found the death rate in some schools was as high as 20 times the national average. Most schools had their own cemeteries, and sometimes when children died, their parents were never informed.
It's really traumatic for those families who don't know what happened to their child or relative in the schools.
Why weren't kids who died at the schools, why weren't they sent home?
To save money.
Last year, archaeologists detected what they said could be 200 unmarked graves at this former school in Kamloops, British Columbia. Weeks later, a further 751 unmarked graves were detected across from the former Marival Residential School on the Cowessess Reserve in Saskatchewan. There was once a Catholic cemetery here, but the headstones were bulldozed in the 1960s by a priest after a dispute with a former chief. And what were these lists for?
So it will tell you.
A small team of researchers has been trying to discover the names of those children buried here, but for decades the government and the church have been reluctant to share their records. Chief Cadmus Delorme is trying to get answers. Do you know that they're all children?
We can't verify how much are children, but based on the research we're doing, a lot of them were children that were forced to go to the Marival Residential School and died in the Marival Residential School.
Chief Delorme says he hopes to give the unidentified children a dignity in death that they never received in life.
I want to make sure that Canada knows the truth, because you can't move to reconciliation till you accept the truth.
The discoveries of the graves opened deep wounds. More than a dozen churches have been vandalized or destroyed, and thousands have marched demanding the Pope apologize and the churches open archives to help identify any missing children. Indigenous communities across the country have begun conducting their own searches using ground-penetrating radar.
We've laid out a number of grids throughout this landscape.
Archaeologists Keisha Supernant and Terry Clark say 35 unmarked graves have been discovered at the Muskowgan School.
There's something going on there that's not natural.
When we were there this past October, they found what appeared to be another. According to survivor accounts, children sometimes had to dig their classmates' graves.
The priests or the school officials would force the kids to dig other children's graves.
Yep. Can you imagine being like 10 or 11 and digging a grave for your classmate? What that must have been like.
Keisha Supernant says the search for unmarked graves will continue for years.
This is very emotional work. It's very devastating work. It's heartbreaking for everyone who's involved.
You feel that too?
I do. Our communities still feel the impacts of these institutions in our everyday lives. We're way overrepresented in child welfare and adoptions and foster care. We're way overrepresented in the prisons. You can draw a direct line with that to these places and the pain of that has been passed on from generation to generation.
I started school here in 1958.
Ed Bitternose, whose Cree understands that pain. He was 8 years old when he was taken to the Muskowgan School. His parents lived within sight of the school, and when he tried to run away, he says the priests forced him to kneel on a broom handle for 3 days.
That's where my house was. I would sit here and wonder why I couldn't be home.
That must have been devastating.
Yeah.
It wasn't only adults he feared. Some students, themselves victims of abuse, preyed on other children.
Were you abused here?
Yeah. Actually, in this room here, by one of the boys.
In this very room?
This very area here.
Later, he says he was also sexually molested by a nun. When he left school, he was rudderless and violent and turned to alcohol. When he got married, he says, he didn't know how to show affection.
You didn't know what love was?
No. I never felt it here. I didn't start saying I loved her until we were married about 40 years, and then I was very careful how I said it.
You didn't say to your wife for 40 years that you loved her?
Yeah.
He says his life changed when he began rediscovering his Cree culture. Raising buffalo and sharing traditional knowledge with children brought healing and finally an understanding of the word love.
You can say that now?
I can say that now. And it feels good. And I still joke with my wife about that. Don't say that too loud, you know.
So you can say it, you just don't want to say it too loud?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, you know what? It's better than nothing.
Yes, that's what she says. Yeah.
As for Leona Wolf, her life and the lives of her children and grandchildren have been plagued by violence and substance abuse. Intergenerational trauma, she says, that began the day her own mother was sent to school at Muskowgan.
Did you see the impact of this place on your mom?
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. By drinking a lot, being mean to me, and it impacted us, me and my brother and my siblings.
What was done to her, she passed on to you.
To me.
And what was done to you and others here
was passed on to my children. This is why sometimes I go into my rage of anger and I cry. Because it was all done to us, all of us. But it's going to stop now. You know, it is.
You believe that?
I'm breaking the cycle with my great-grandchildren.
Leona Wolf has returned to her traditions as well. Walking the halls of Muskowkin, she began to sing Hail Mary, a prayer she was forced to learn here long ago. Now she sings it her own way. That's not how you sang it here when you were in school, though, was it?
Nope.
You made peace with the Virgin Mary by singing that song.
Peace with myself.
Last April at the Vatican, Pope Francis apologized to Canada's Indigenous peoples for the deplorable abuses they suffered in Catholic-run residential schools. He'll travel to Canada next month to make the apology in person.
Last year, the death of George Floyd in the hands of Minneapolis police came on Memorial Day. 99 years before, that same week, Black Americans suffered a massacre. In the days after World War I, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Greenwood was among the wealthiest Black communities. Oil made Greenwood rich, but jealousy made it suffer. In 1921, a white mob with incendiary rage burned Greenwood to ash. Even memories were murdered when the dead were dropped into unmarked graves. In December of 2019, before the pandemic, we found Tulsa preparing to embrace a reckoning with a plan to exhume the truth and raise the dead.
The community that is Greenwood has thriving businesses, professional offices, doctors, lawyers, dentists.
John W. Franklin speaks of Greenwood in the present tense.
Greenwood is the nexus of that African American community.
Perhaps because he studied Greenwood in 32 years as a historian at the Smithsonian, or likely because Greenwood is personal.
And my grandfather moves here from Rentersville in February 1921. And he's the first person in the family to go to college, Buck Culver Franklin.
Buck Colbert Franklin was a lawyer who chased his dream to a promised land. Booker T. Washington named Greenwood Negro Wall Street because the district was lined with Black-owned shops, restaurants, 2 newspapers, a 54-room grand hotel, a hospital, and the Dreamland Theater, which would soon boast air conditioning. But on the day after Memorial Day, 1921, Buck Franklin awoke to fearful news.
He hears that there's to be possibly a lynching. There's this Black man who's been caught with this white woman in the elevator, and the newspapers are saying, read all about it. There's extra, read all about it.
Tulsa's white newspapers told of a Black teenager who allegedly attacked a white female elevator operator. At the jail, a lynch mob demanded the prisoner. Black veterans of World War I arrived to shield the defendant for his day in court. A shot was fired, and in a running gun battle, the mob chased the Black vets to Greenwood.
One of the moments during the riot that your grandfather wrote about was this. On they rushed, whooping to the tops of their voices, firing their guns every step they took. What is it like for you to read those words today?
He too was traumatized by seeing people being shot in front of his eyes. He describes a woman who's trying to find her child who's run in front of her, and she's unafraid of the bullets raining down because her concern is to find her child.
What began as an attempted lynching at the jail erupted into a massacre. From a high grain elevator, a machine gun laid fire on Greenwood Avenue.
Where's the fire department? Where's the police when we need them? We're part of a city. This is not some small town. This is a city of wealth and order and governance. It is now taken over by a mob.
The police joined the mob. National Guard troops pressed the attack against what one Guard officer called the enemy. Quotes from eyewitnesses include, Old women and men, children, were running and screaming everywhere. A deputy sheriff reported a black man dragged behind a car. His head was being bashed in, the deputy said, bouncing on the steel rails and bricks. But what happened next may have frightened Buck Franklin even more.
And he hears planes circling and sees roofs of buildings catching fire. And these are from turpentine balls, burning turpentine balls dropped from planes.
The first time in American history, the airplanes were used to terrorize America was not at 9/11, was not at Pearl Harbor. It was right here in the Greenwood district.
Reverend Robert Turner's Vernon AME Church was among at least 5 churches burned, along with 1,200 homes. A photo was crudely and imperfectly hand-lettered at the time, running the Negro out of Tulsa.
36 odd square blocks, city blocks, was destroyed. And before they destroyed it, they looted. They took nice furniture, money.
When the black hospital burned, white hospitals refused to take Greenwood's wounded. Those who bled to death included Greenwood's most prominent surgeon. Ultimately, one hospital did make space in its basement for black casualties. The number of dead is estimated between 150 and 300. Survivors included 10,000 now homeless African Americans. 6,000 of them were herded into internment camps and then released weeks later.
I don't know how they did it, but the following Sunday after the massacre, they came and worshiped in our basement. And that's the same basement that we have today.
The murder of a black man at the hands of police is today shouted into the national memory.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
But in 1921, it remained possible to erase a genocide.
I grew up attending segregated Tulsa public schools. Never in any of the schools was anything ever said about it.
The congregation of Vernon AME Church is 2 generations beyond 1921, but they too were victimized.
This was not taught
No.
in the public schools.
No.
You never heard about this in class.
You never heard a word about it.
When I went to OU in 1998, I was sitting in a class of African American history, and the professor was talking about this place where black people had businesses and had money and had doctors and lawyers, and he said it was in Tulsa. And I raised my hand and said, no, I'm from Tulsa. That's not accurate. And he was talking about this massacre, riot. I said, man, what are you talking about? I said, I went to school on Greenwood. I've never heard of this ever.
How many people were arrested, tried for what happened in Greenwood?
No one.
200 or 300 people murdered, an entire community burned to the ground, and the police were unable to find a single person.
It's a real tragedy. All the thousands of claims that were filed by African Americans, not a one insurance company paid that claim. And our church was included.
No insurance honored for black Tulsans, no arrests made, no complete count of the dead. The Salvation Army recorded only that it fed 37 gravediggers. The nameless were buried in unmarked graves, while their families were locked down in the internment camps.
I wonder if there are any doubts in this room about whether there are mass graves in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No doubts.
My great-grandmother...
Oral histories passed down generations pointed to at least 4 sites of possible mass graves.
As a mayor, I view it as a homicide investigation. Phase 1...
G.T. Bynum is Tulsa's Republican mayor. In 2018, he ordered an investigation of all remaining evidence.
What you have is a case of law and civil order being overrun by people who were filled with hatred. We believe at the end of this road we're walking down right now is one of the sites where we found an anomaly.
Anomalies of disturbed earth showed up in the studies of Scott Hammerstedt. That's not a mower. It's ground-penetrating radar
And right here is the anomaly as we see it.
He's a senior researcher at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. The anomalies that we're looking at, what are those?
It's just a contrast between the surrounding soil that's undisturbed and then this soil that has been disturbed.
So we're not seeing in these images human remains?
No, it's definitely not like CSI. You don't see individual skeletons, you just see disturbances and contrasts, which is why you can't really say necessarily that for sure it's a common grave, but it's very consistent with one.
Of course, there's any number of things it could be. That's always the thing I have to remind myself.
And there's only one way to find out.
That is exactly right. We have to dig. We have to dig.
An excavation in October, led by University of Florida forensic anthropologist Phoebe Stubblefield, revealed a mass grave with at least 12 individuals. Determining cause of death will be complicated because of that period's Spanish flu pandemic. So just because you find a burial site, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's from the massacre.
Correct, and so I'm interested in markers like signs of violence or any kind of ballistic injuries or chop injuries.
Can you retrieve DNA?
If it's a good preservation state, there's a high probability.
Would it be possible, in your opinion, to actually identify some of these people?
We could try for genealogical matches. So if we had people now who say, oh, I'm missing a relative from that time period, here's my DNA, then we can make matches through similar markers and do the genealogical matches.
There's a long legacy from 1921. Tulsa is still one of the most segregated cities in the country.
Yes.
The north part of Tulsa is black, the south part is white, and the twain don't meet very much.
Right, because of the history of racial disparity that exists in our city. A kid that's growing up in the predominantly African-American part of our city is expected to live 11 years less than a kid that's growing up in a whiter part of the city. By the way, Tulsa is not unique in that regard. You see disparities like that in major cities all around America.
A full excavation begins on June 1st. Next steps include recommendations for permanent burial and the question of how to honor those who have waited 100 years for justice.
How do you commemorate an event that gives dignity and honor to the people who've been lost?
We have taken in recent decades in our memorials to etch the names of every single person who was lost. The 9/11 memorial, the Vietnam memorial. That's not going to be possible here. We don't know the names.
We don't know the names. And you're going to have to do some kind of, we have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So it has to be something that is representative of lost souls, lost in anonymity. Something like that will have to be planned.
No one can say when human remains began surfacing in Clearwater, Florida. There was the pipeline crew that churned up bones in a trench. Later, remains of the dead were found at an elementary school, a swimming pool, and an office building. It seemed like something of a curse for what had been done in the name of progress and greed in the old segregated South. As we first reported last fall, the truth of what happened in the 40s and 50s was meant to stay buried. But in a neighborhood called Clearwater Heights, residents with long memories recognized a grave injustice. In the first half of the 20th century, Clearwater Heights was a black neighborhood, thriving, proud, and anchored by faith.
Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, Bethany CME, and New Zion Missionary Baptist Church were all located on the heights.
And so is St. Matthew's Baptist, where we heard stories of childhood in the Heights, including those of Diane Stevens and Eleanor Breland.
They had businesses, barbershops, there were hairdressers over there. There was a cab company. It only had one cab, but it was still a cab company.
Right there on Greenwood, they had different places where even Ray Charles performed there. Also, James Brown performed up there.
But even the famous could not stay in a white Clearwater hotel or walk on the beach or swim in the bay. Segregation bound their lives and exiled even their memory to segregated graveyards. How many of you believe you have ancestors in one of these cemeteries? About half of you. The segregated cemeteries of Clearwater were sacred ground until the ground became valuable. In the 1950s, headlines announced that the city of Clearwater made a deal on moving a Negro cemetery. Hundreds of African American bodies were to be reburied to make way for a swimming pool. A department store was planned for the site of another black cemetery, where again the bodies were to be moved. But O'Neill Larkin remembers, many years later, his first revelation that something was terribly wrong.
It's not an imaginary thing that I seen. It's what I seen with my own eyes.
Larkin, 83 years old, watched a construction crew in 1984 dig a trench through the site of a relocated black cemetery.
But I remember the parking lot where the engineers, traffic engineer, was cutting the lines through, and they cut through 2 coffins. That was my first knowledge of seeing it because I walked out there and I seen it myself.
In 2019, the Tampa Bay Times reported many segregated cemeteries in Florida had been essentially paved. It was then that the modern city of Clearwater decided to exhume the truth.
People deserve to be treated with respect. That's the most important thing.
Rebecca O'Sullivan and Aaron McKendry are archaeologists for a company called Cardno. Cardno was hired by the city to map the desecration.
These individuals were loved. They were family members. They were fathers and mothers. And they were interred with love.
McKendry and O'Sullivan pushed ground-penetrating radar over a segregated cemetery where this office site stands today. This overlay shows part of their discovery: 328 likely graves, many under the parking lot, perhaps a few under the building, and more there on the right, beneath South Missouri Avenue. 550 graves are in the cemetery's record. McKendry and O'Sullivan found evidence of 11 having been moved in the 1950s. So there may be hundreds of bodies still at that site.
It's possible.
Not far away, the archaeologists probed another former cemetery.
Where there's more what looks like the intact graves.
Here, in the 1950s, rather than integrate the white community pool, the city said it would move hundreds of bodies to build a black swimming pool and a black school. But the bodies weren't removed.
But the bodies were not removed.
Cardno found the proof last year. It excavated just deep enough to confirm what ground-penetrating radar had suggested.
It is their resting place.
A prayer was said over the site. Then they planed the sand and sieved a century of time in search of grave markers or tributes. Inevitably, relics included human remains, teeth at the office building site, and bones at the school, which had closed in 2008 because it was obsolete. Are there grave sites underneath the school?
All of the information and the data that we collected does indicate that there are additional burials likely below the footprint of that school building.
I would be very surprised if they didn't find any bones when they were over there.
Had to.
O'Neill Larkin watched the excavation and imagined the groundbreaking at the school construction site in 1961.
To dig the foundation to put this school upon, they had to hit some form of remains.
It's likely some families could not afford a tombstone, but the archaeologists found graves were marked.
Doesn't it look like one of those metal plaque things?
This is a marker that would have been used initially after the burial if a stone was not ready to be placed. And in some cases, this is all that would have been used to mark the location of a burial.
Aaron McKendry showed us Cardno's catalog of evidence. It's a mercury dime.
It is a mercury dime.
This dime, new in '42, was among many tributes left with the dead.
We also found this brass wedding ring at approximately the same location and the same depth as the dime.
71?
The tributes and disturbed human remains were carefully reburied exactly where they were found, pending a decision on what to do next. If you could speak to these people who were interred and then lost, what would you tell them?
I hear you. I'm working. I want to recognize the contributions, the life you lived. I recognize and see your humanity. The cheapest land, the worst places.
Anthropologist Antoinette Jackson leads the African American Burial Ground Project at the University of South Florida. She's building a database of desecrated cemeteries.
Not just Clearwater's nationally, from New York all the way out toward Texas and all the way down to South Florida, where these cemeteries have been built over, erased, marginalized, underfunded, and need support in order to make them whole and have this history known. This is not an isolated story, unfortunately.
So far, Jackson has listed about 107 effaced black cemeteries nationwide.
Underneath the current housing...
Under housing, freeways, and the county-owned parking lot of Tropicana Field, home to baseball's Tampa Bay Rays.
What we want to bring forward is the memory, the knowledge that these sites were there, these places, these cemeteries, these families were there, lived, died, worked, contributed to our country, to their communities, to our hometowns.
Is there evidence of white cemeteries being lost, abandoned, forgotten in the way that these are?
There are abandoned cemeteries across the board. There are cemeteries that are not only African American cemeteries or black cemeteries that have been in some way desecrated. But the issue is more acute with black cemeteries because of issues like slavery, segregation, in which this particular community were legally and intentionally considered lesser than or marginalized by law.
When a cemetery disappears, what is lost?
History.
History. Respect. A great deal of respect, because you can no longer visit.
Right.
And bring closure to your own soul.
A cemetery is supposed to be your final resting place.
Honorable place.
Final.
In Clearwater, they're debating how to honor those entombed beneath the school, South Missouri Avenue, and the property of the Frank Crumb Company, which bought its headquarters for its staffing business decades after the cemetery was erased.
I'm sure that when they purchased that property, they didn't know that there were bodies there.
So the head would be facing.
Zebby Atkinson is the former head of the Clearwater NAACP. What would you say to someone who might make the argument that disturbing Missouri Avenue, disturbing the Frank Crumb Corporation, disturbing the schools, way too much effort at this point in time?
I would say that that's not their call. They have no family buried there.
Atkinson is helping lead the conversation of what to do now among descendants, businesses, and the city.
See the teeth. Yeah, that are right there.
Some people want to have the bodies moved to a place where they can properly memorialize them. Some of the descendant community wants to let the people stay where they are. Those are the type of things that need to be worked out.
How do you work them out?
We have to sit and talk about it. I mean, there is no easy answer with that.
Whether the failure in the last century to move the graves was deceit, incompetence, or indifference, we do not know. But today, Clearwater is spending $291,000 to learn the truth. The city told us it is searching for a compromise that will honor the dead. The Frank Crumb Company told us it wants to be part of the community's solution. Ideas include monuments, but for a few, like O'Neill Larkin, there's only one route to justice.
Tear it down.
Tear the building down.
Tear it down. Tear down that building, as far as I'm concerned. Tear the school down. Make it a shrine of memories that people can go and use it in a proper way of remembering, to treat them with more dignity than what this has been treated.
We noticed dignity was treated gently in the white cemeteries of Clearwater. In this one, we found a monument to a Confederate soldier, his grave decorated today with a fresh banner of racism. But when this Confederate sacred ground found itself blocking the road to progress, the small cemetery under those trees in the middle was granted a reverent, circular detour. Of those citizens buried in the black cemeteries of Clearwater, we have images of only these: the Reverend Arthur L. Jackson, the Reverend Joseph Hines, and Mac Dixon Sr., who was buried beside his wife Florence, 3 children, and 2 grandchildren. We do not know the faces of 500 more who remain forever bound by segregation and lost to the memory of time.
It is not often you get the chance to meet a man who holds a place in history like Ben Ferencz. When we first reported on him back in 2017, he was 97 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and he had served as prosecutor of what's been called the biggest murder trial ever. The courtroom was Nuremberg, the crime genocide, and the defendants, a group of German SS officers accused of committing the largest number of Nazi killings outside the concentration camps. More than 1 million men, women, and children shot in their own towns and villages in cold blood. Ferencz is the last Nuremberg prosecutor alive today. But he isn't content just being a part of 20th century history. He believes he has something important to offer the world right now.
You know, you have seen the ugliest side of humanity.
Yes.
You've really seen evil. And look at you. You're the sunniest man I've ever met. The most optimistic.
You want to get some more friends? Oh, this is nice.
Watching Ben Ferencz during his daily swim,
All right.
his gym workout,
I'm showing off now.
and his morning push-up regimen
100.
is to realize he isn't just the sunniest man we've ever met. He may also be the fittest.
How's that?
And that's just the beginning.
The case we present is a plea of humanity to law.
This is Ferencz making his opening statement in the Nuremberg courtroom 73 years ago.
The charges we have brought accuse the defendants of having committed crimes against humanity.
The Nuremberg trials after World War II were historic, the first international war crimes tribunals ever held. Hitler's top lieutenants were prosecuted first. Then a series of subsequent trials were mounted against other Nazi leaders, including 22 SS officers responsible for killing more than 1 million people, not in concentration camps, but in towns and villages across Eastern Europe. They would never have been brought to justice were it not for Ben Ferencz.
You look so young.
I was so young. I was 27 years old.
Had you prosecuted trials before?
Never in my life. I don't recall if I'd ever been in a courtroom, actually.
Ferencz had immigrated to the U.S. as a baby, the son of poor Jewish parents from a small town in Romania. He grew up in a tough New York City neighborhood where his father found work as a janitor. Ferencz learned quickly. He became the first in his family to go to college, then got a scholarship to Harvard Law School. But during his first semester, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and he, like many classmates, raced to enlist. He wanted to be a pilot, but the Army Air Corps wouldn't take him.
And they said, no, you're too short. Your legs won't reach the pedals. The Marines, they just looked at me and said, forget it, kid.
So he finished at Harvard, then enlisted as a private in the Army. Part of an artillery battalion, he landed on the beach at Normandy and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Toward the end of the war, because of his legal training, he was transferred to a brand new unit in General Patton's Third Army, created to investigate war crimes. As U.S. forces liberated concentration camps, his job was to rush in and gather evidence. Ferencz told us he is still haunted by the things he saw and the stories he heard in those camps.
A father who, his son told me the story. His father had died just as we were entering the camp. And the father had routinely saved a piece of his bread for his son, and he kept it under his arm at night. He kept it under his arm at night so the other inmates wouldn't steal it, you know? So you see these human stories which are they're not real, but they were real.
Ferencz came home, married his childhood sweetheart, and vowed never to set foot in Germany again. But that didn't last long. General Telford Taylor, in charge of the Nuremberg trials, asked him to direct a team of researchers in Berlin, one of whom found a cache of top-secret documents in the ruins of the German Foreign Ministry.
He gave me a bunch of binders, 4 binders, and these were daily reports from the Eastern Front. Which unit entered which town, how many people they killed. It's classified. So many Jews, so many Gypsies, so many others.
Ferencz had stumbled upon reports sent back to headquarters by secret SS units called Einsatzgruppen, or action groups. Their job had been to follow the German army as it invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and kill communists, gypsies, and especially Jews.
There were 3,000 SS officers trained for the purpose and directed to kill without pity or remorse every single Jewish man, woman, and child they could lay their hands on.
So they went right in after the troops.
Come up behind the troop, round up the Jews, kill them all.
Only one piece of film is known to exist of the Einsatzgruppen at work. It isn't easy to watch.
Well, this is a typical operation. Well, see, here, they rounded them up. They all have already tags on them. And they're chasing them.
Making them run to their own death?
Yes. There was a rabbi coming along there. Just put him in the ditch, shoot him there. See, bingo. Oh, my God. Yeah.
This footage came to light years later. At the time, Ferencz just had the documents, and he started adding up the numbers.
When I reached over 1 million people murdered that way, over 1 million people, it's more people than you've ever seen in your life. I took a sample, I got on the next plane, flew from Berlin down to Nuremberg, and I said to Taylor, General, we've got to put on a new trial.
But the trials were already underway, and prosecution staff was stretched thin. Taylor told Ferencz adding another trial was impossible.
And I started screaming. I said, look, I got here mass murder on a parallel scale. And he said, can you do this in addition to your other work? And I said, sure. He said, okay, so you do it.
And that's how 27-year-old Ben Ferencz became the chief prosecutor of 22 Einsatzgruppen commanders at trial number 9 at Nuremberg.
How do you plead to this indictment? Guilty or not guilty? Nicht schuldig.
Standard routine. Nicht schuldig, not guilty.
Guilty or not guilty? Nicht schuldig.
They all say not guilty.
Same thing, not guilty.
But Ferencz knew they were guilty and could prove it. Without calling a single witness, he entered into evidence the defendants' own reports of what they had done. Exhibit 111. In the last 10 weeks, we have liquidated around 55,000 Jews. Exhibit 179 from Kiev in 1941. The Jews of the city were ordered to present themselves. About 34,000 reported, including women and children. After they had been made to give up their clothing and valuables, all of them were killed, which took several days. Exhibit 84 from Einsatzgruppen D in March of 1942. Total number executed so far, 91,678. Einsatzgruppen D was the unit of Ferencz's lead defendant, Otto Ohlendorf. He didn't deny the killings. He had the gall to claim they were done in self-defense.
He was not ashamed of that. He was proud of that. He was carrying out his government's instructions.
How did you not hit him?
There was only one time I wanted to really, one of these, my defendants, he gets up and he says, "Was, Juden erschossen? Das höre ich hier zum ersten Mal," which is, what, the Jews were shot? I hear it here for the first time. Boy, I felt if I'd had a bayonet, I would have jumped over the thing and put a bayonet right through one ear and let it come out the other. You know, that son of a bitch.
Had his name
and
down
I've got his reports of how many he killed. You know, I'm an innocent lamb.
Did you look at the defendants' faces?
Defendants' faces were blank, all the time. Defendants absolutely blank. They could they're waiting for a bus.
What was going on inside of you?
Of me?
Yeah.
I'm still churning.
To this minute.
I'm still churning.
All 22 defendants were found guilty, and 4 of them, including Ohlendorf, were hanged. Ferencz says his goal from the beginning was to affirm the rule of law and deter similar crimes from ever being committed again.
Did you meet a lot of people who perpetrated war crimes who would otherwise, in your opinion, have been just a normal, upstanding citizen?
Of course, is my answer. These men would never have been murderers had it not been for the war. These were people who could quote Goethe, who loved Wagner, who were polite.
What turns a man into a savage beast like that?
He's not a savage. He's an intelligent, patriotic human being.
He's a savage when he does the murder, though.
No, he's a patriotic human being acting in the interest of his country in his mind.
You don't think they turn into savages even for the act?
Do you think the man who dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima was a savage? Now I will tell you something very profound, which I have learned after many years. War makes murderers out of otherwise decent people. All wars and all decent people.
So Ferencz has spent the rest of his life trying to deter war and war crimes by establishing an international court like Nuremberg. He scored a victory when the International Criminal Court in The Hague was created in 1998.
May it please your honors.
He delivered the closing argument in the court's first case.
Now, you've been at this for 50 years, if not more. We've had genocide since then in Cambodia.
Going on right this minute.
Going on right this minute in Sudan. We've had Rwanda. We've had Bosnia. You're not getting very far.
Well, don't say that. People get discouraged. They should remember from me, it takes courage not to be discouraged.
Did anybody ever say that you're naive?
Of course. Some
Are
people
you
say I'm
naive
crazy.
here?
Well, if it's naive to want peace instead of war, let them make sure they say I'm naive, because I want peace instead of war. If they tell me they want war instead of peace, I don't say they're naive. I say they're stupid. Stupid to an incredible degree to send young people out to kill other young people they don't even know, who never did anybody any harm, never harmed them. That is the current system. I am naive? That's insane. Thank you very much.
Ferencz is legendary in the world of international law, and he's still at it.
Are you going to help me save the world?
I heard so.
It's up to you.
He never stops pushing his message.
War, not war. Never give up.
Never give up.
And he's donating much of his savings to a genocide prevention initiative at the Holocaust Museum. He says he's grateful for the life he's lived in this country, and it's his turn to give back.
You are such an idealist.
I don't think I'm an idealist, I'm a realist. And I see the progress. The progress has been remarkable. Look at the emancipation of women in my lifetime. You're sitting here as a female. Look what's happened to the same-sex marriages. To tell somebody a man can become a woman can become a man, and a man can marry a man, they would say, you're crazy. But it's a reality today. So the world is changing, and you shouldn't, be despairing because it's never happened before. Nothing new ever happened before. But we're on a roll. We're marching forward.
Ben, I'm sitting here listening to you, and you're very wise, and you're full of energy and passion, and I can't believe you're 97 years old.
Well, I'm still a young man.
Clearly.
And I'm still in there fighting. And you know what keeps me going? I know I'm right.